Sometimes survival isn't about what you have. It's about what you're willing to give up for someone else. And for 16-year-old Gideon Nash, that choice was about to transform him from a forgotten mountain drifter into the most hunted man in the territory. Picture this. You're barely surviving on scraps and determination, with winter closing in fast around the mountain peaks. Your stomach hasn't seen a proper meal in 3 days. Your clothes are more holes than fabric, and the approaching storm threatens to be your final test. Then you spot something that changes everything. A splash of bright red against pristine white snow. Fresh blood. Most people would turn around and walk away. Smart people would definitely walk away. But Gideon Nash had never been accused of being smart, and what he found following that crimson trail would drag him into something far more dangerous than he ever imagined. The wind cut through his worn shirt like ice daggers as he climbed that rocky slope. Each step a reminder of just how little he had left. At 16, Gideon had learned to survive on nothing but stubbornness and the occasional act of kindness from strangers. But kindness was rare in these mountains, especially with winter breathing down everyone's neck. That's when he saw her. A young Native American girl, maybe his own age, collapsed in the snow and bleeding from a deep gash on her leg. Her traditional buckskin dress was torn and frost had already begun forming on her long black hair. Even from a distance, Gideon could tell she wouldn't last another hour in this brutal cold. Every instinct he'd developed over years of mountain survival screamed at him to keep walking. Getting involved with tribal matters meant trouble. The kind of trouble that got white settlers killed, or worse. The relationship between his people and the local tribes had been tense for years, with violence erupting over land disputes and broken treaties. But as Gideon stared at her pale face, something deeper than survival instinct kicked in. Maybe it was the way she looked so small against the vast white landscape. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be alone and desperate. Whatever it was, he couldn't bring himself to abandon someone who needed help. "Can't just leave you here," he muttered, kneeling beside her motionless form. The girl stirred as he touched her shoulder, dark eyes snapping open with sudden fear. Her hand shot to a bone knife at her belt, but weakness made her movements clumsy and slow. Gideon raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. "Easy there. I want to help." She spoke rapidly in her native tongue, pointing desperately toward the eastern peaks. Even through the language barrier, her meaning was crystal clear. She needed to get home, and she needed to get there fast. When she tried to stand, her injured leg buckled immediately, sending her crashing back to the frozen ground with a cry of pain. Gideon caught her before she could hit the snow again, feeling just how cold her skin had become. Hypothermia was already setting in, and without immediate shelter and warmth, she'd be dead within the hour. "Those peaks?" he asked, pointing east toward the jagged mountain range. "That's 2 days through Dead Man's Pass." She nodded desperately, tears beginning to freeze on her cheeks. Gideon looked at his meager supplies. Barely enough food for himself, no medical supplies to speak of, and winter gear that was more patches than original fabric. Taking her through those treacherous mountains would likely kill them both, but leaving her here would definitely kill her. The choice should have been simple: self-preservation versus certain death. But as Gideon stared into those desperate eyes, he realized some decisions can't be made with logic alone. "All right," he said quietly. "We go together, or not at all." What followed was 18 hours of the most grueling travel either of them had ever experienced. Gideon half carried, half dragged the girl through terrain that would challenge experienced mountain men. She drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words he couldn't understand but somehow felt deep in his bones. Desperate prayers, maybe, or warnings about what was coming. The cold was merciless, cutting through their inadequate clothing and sapping their strength with every step. More than once, Gideon considered stopping to rest, but he knew that rest meant death in these conditions. They had to keep moving, had to reach the relative safety of tribal lands before the storm caught them in the open. When they finally reached the edge of her people's territory, the girl managed to stand on her own for the first time since he'd found her. She pressed something into his palm, a small carved stone that felt warm against his frozen skin, before disappearing into the forest without looking back. Gideon stumbled back toward his mountain cave as dawn broke over the peaks, exhausted but alive. He'd done the right thing, even if it had nearly killed him. The carved stone in his pocket seemed to pulse with its own heat, a reminder of the choice he'd made and the life he'd saved. But as he approached his shelter, something made his blood run colder than the mountain wind. Dozens of hoof prints surrounded his cave entrance, fresh prints made while he was gone. And carved into the bark of the tree beside his door was a symbol he'd never seen before. 3 parallel lines crossed by a single arrow. Someone had been here. Someone who knew exactly where to find him. Gideon circled his cave 3 times before entering, his hand never leaving the rusty knife at his belt. The hoofprints told a story he didn't want to read. At least 15 horses, maybe more, all shod in the distinctive style he'd seen on tribal ponies. They'd waited here for hours, studying his meager belongings, learning his patterns. Inside the cave, everything looked exactly as he'd left it. But something felt wrong. His sleeping blanket had been moved just slightly, but enough for someone who knew every thread of his few possessions. His small cooking pot sat at a different angle. Even his collection of smooth river stones had been disturbed. They were looking for something, he whispered to the empty cave. But what could he possibly have that warriors would want? He owned nothing of value. No gold, no weapons worth stealing, no information about settler movements. Unless his fingers found the carved stone the girl had pressed into his palm. In daylight, he could see it clearly now. Polished black rock with intricate symbols carved deep into its surface. It felt warm against his skin, almost alive. A branch snapped outside, and Gideon froze. Every muscle in his body tensed like a coiled spring. That wasn't wind. Something heavy had stepped on dead wood, something trying to move quietly but failing. Peering through a crack in the rocks, his heart nearly stopped. 3 warriors sat motionless on their horses 30 yards away, watching his cave with the patience of natural predators. War paint streaked their faces, and eagle feathers adorned their long black hair. Their eyes never moved from his hiding place. They knew he was inside. The question was, how long had they been waiting? And how had they found him so quickly? If you're wondering what happens when 30 armed warriors come calling for something you didn't know you had, stick around. Because what Gideon thought was a simple act of kindness was about to ignite a chain of events that would test everything he believed about courage, honor, and survival in the unforgiving American frontier. The girl couldn't have told them where to find him. She'd barely been conscious when they separated, mumbling words he couldn't understand through chattering teeth. Yet here they were, tracking him down within hours of his return. One warrior raised his hand, and somewhere behind Gideon's cave, horses whinnied softly in response. More riders. He was completely surrounded. The lead warrior dismounted slowly, deliberately, his hand resting on a tomahawk that looked like it had tasted blood recently. When he spoke, his voice carried easily through the thin mountain air, each word measured and precise. "Boy who helped our daughter. We know you are there." Gideon's throat went dry. Daughter. The girl wasn't just any tribal member. She was family to whoever these men were, which made everything infinitely more complicated. In frontier politics, family meant alliances, responsibilities, and debts that could span generations. "Come out," the warrior continued, his voice carrying an edge that made Gideon's skin crawl. "We wish to speak." Every fiber of Gideon's being screamed danger. In every story he'd heard around trading post fires, white men who got involved with tribal affairs ended up scalped or worse. But he was trapped like a rabbit in a burrow, with nowhere to run, and winter closing in fast. The warrior's next words confirmed his worst fears. "You have something that belongs to us." The carved stone seemed to burn against his palm. Whatever this object was, it was important enough to bring armed men into the mountains. Important enough to track him down within hours. Gideon closed his eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible decision. Step outside and face whatever these warriors wanted, or stay hidden and eventually die of thirst and cold when winter trapped him in the cave. When he opened his eyes, the lead warrior was walking directly toward his cave entrance, and his expression suggested patience was no longer an option. Gideon stepped from the cave with his hands raised high, the carved stone hidden in his closed fist. What greeted him was something straight out of his worst nightmares. 30 warriors materialized from behind rocks and trees like shadows gaining substance. More men than he'd imagined, all armed, all watching him with expressions he couldn't read. The lead warrior stopped 5 feet away, close enough that Gideon could see the intricate scars marking his weathered face. This was no ordinary hunting party. These were seasoned fighters, and their presence here meant something far more serious than a simple rescue mission. "I am Takakota," the warrior said in carefully measured English. "Ayana is my daughter." Gideon's mouth went dry. A chief's daughter. He'd saved a chief's daughter without knowing it, and now her father stood before him with enough men to level a small town. The political implications crashed down on him like an avalanche. This wasn't just about helping someone in need anymore. This was about tribal honor, family obligations, and territorial disputes that could ignite into full-scale war. "She told me what you did," Takakota continued, his dark eyes never leaving Gideon's face. "How you carried her through the killing cold when you could have walked away." The other warriors remained silent, but Gideon could feel their tension like electricity before a thunderstorm. One wrong word, one misunderstood gesture, and this conversation would end very differently. Anyone would have done the same. Gideon managed, though his voice cracked on the words. Takakota's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "No. Most would not. Most fear us too much to risk helping." He gestured to his men. "We have been hunting the men who attacked our camp. 3 settlers armed with rifles who shot my daughter when she tried to warn them away from our sacred grounds." Gideon felt ice form in his stomach. Settlers, white men like him, men who might assume he was working with them, part of some larger conspiracy against the tribe. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. "We tracked them to your mountain," Takakota said, his voice growing harder. "Their trail led directly past your cave. We thought, perhaps," he left the sentence hanging, but the implication struck Gideon like a physical blow. They'd suspected him of being involved in the attack, of using his rescue of the girl as cover for something more sinister. But Ayana described the boy who saved her. Takakota continued, "Thin, hungry, with kind eyes and gentle hands. Not the description of a man who shoots women." Relief flooded through Gideon, but it was short-lived. If these warriors were hunting armed settlers in his territory, blood would be spilled soon, and when territorial authorities came looking for answers, they'd find him. The only white face in the area, the only witness to whatever was about to happen. "The men you're hunting," Gideon said carefully. "They're still up here?" Takakota nodded grimly. "Close, very close. They made camp in the valley below, thinking they are safe." His hand moved to his tomahawk. "They are wrong." One of the younger warriors spoke rapidly in their native tongue, pointing toward the valley. Takakota's expression darkened as he listened, the kind of darkness that comes before storms that reshape entire landscapes. "What is it?" Gideon asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "My scout says smoke rises from their camp. They are cooking fresh meat." Takakota's voice turned deadly quiet. "Meat they stole from families they murdered yesterday." The weight of the situation crashed down on Gideon like a mountain slide. He was trapped between a war party seeking vengeance and desperate criminals with nothing left to lose. The mountains that had been his sanctuary were about to become a killing ground, and he was standing right in the middle of it. Takakota stepped closer, his presence commanding and dangerous. "You saved my daughter's life. For this, I offer you choice." Gideon waited, hardly breathing, as the chief's words hung in the frigid air. "Leave these mountains now, before the sun sets. Ride far and fast, and never return." Takakota's eyes bore into him with the intensity of a man who'd never lost a battle. "Or stay. and help us end the men who spill innocent blood on sacred ground." The carved stone felt heavy in Gideon's palm as he realized the impossible position he was in. Run and spend his life looking over his shoulder, wondering if he'd made the right choice. Or stay and become part of something that could destroy everything he'd built in these mountains. But as Takakota waited for his answer, gunshots echoed from the valley below, their sharp cracks bouncing off canyon walls like thunder. The killing had already begun. The gunshots echoed off the mountain walls like thunder, followed by screams that chilled Gideon's blood. Not war cries, but screams of terror and pain. Takakota's warriors instantly transformed from waiting statues into fluid motion, mounting their horses with practiced efficiency that spoke of countless battles fought and won. But Takakota himself remained motionless, his eyes locked on Gideon with laser-like intensity. "Choose now, boy. The killing has already begun." Another volley of shots cracked through the air, closer this time. Someone was running up the mountain, firing wildly as they climbed through the trees. Gideon glimpsed 3 figures scrambling up the rocky slope like desperate animals, the settlers fleeing toward his cave with the kind of panic that comes when death is breathing down your neck. "They're coming here," Gideon breathed, realizing the horrible truth. The criminals knew about his cave. They'd been watching his camp, learning his patterns. Now they were leading this fight directly to his doorstep, turning his sanctuary into ground zero for a massacre. Takakota's expression turned deadly. "You know these men?" "No," Gideon said quickly. "But they've been watching my camp. They know where I live." The lead warrior's hand tightened on his weapon. In seconds, armed murderers would reach the cave, followed by 30 tribal warriors seeking blood. Gideon would be caught in the middle of a massacre with nowhere to run, and no way to prove his innocence. "Get behind the rocks," Takakota commanded his men. "Let them come." But Gideon saw something that made his stomach drop like a stone down a well. One of the fleeing settlers carried a rifle he recognized, a distinctive brass-fitted weapon he'd seen in town. It belonged to Marshal Crawford, the territorial lawman who'd been missing for 2 weeks. These weren't just thieves or claim jumpers. They'd killed a federal marshal. "Wait!" Gideon called out as the first settler crashed through the tree line 50 yards below. "If you kill them here, the army will come. They'll blame your people for the marshal's death." Takakota paused, understanding the implications immediately. Dead settlers at a native ambush site would bring cavalry troops and retribution against his entire tribe. The kind of retribution that wouldn't distinguish between warriors and innocent women and children. The 3 criminals were close enough now that Gideon could see their faces, desperate, wild-eyed men with blood on their clothes and death in their wake. The leader spotted the cave and pointed, shouting something to his companions. They were going to use his shelter as a fort. "You cannot let them reach the cave," Takakota said grimly. "If they take position there, we must dig them out. Many will die." Gideon's mind raced like wildfire. The settlers were 30 seconds from his cave. The warriors needed a clear shot but couldn't risk being blamed for a massacre. And he was the only one who could stop it from becoming a bloodbath that would destroy innocent lives across the entire territory. The carved stone seemed to pulse in his palm, and suddenly he understood why Ayana had given it to him. It wasn't just a token of gratitude. It was a symbol of trust, of responsibility. A bridge between 2 worlds that were about to tear each other apart. He stepped into the open, directly into the path of the climbing criminals. "That's far enough," he shouted, raising his hands. The lead settler raised his rifle, finger on the trigger, his eyes wild with desperation and fear. "Get out of the way, boy, or I'll put you down." Behind the rocks, 30 warriors drew their weapons silently, waiting for Takakota's signal. One wrong word from Gideon, and the mountain would explode in violence that would echo through history books for generations. But instead of stepping aside, Gideon did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He sat down. Right there in the middle of the confrontation, with rifles pointed at his chest and 30 warriors ready to strike, he calmly lowered himself to the ground and crossed his legs like he had all the time in the world. "What the hell are you doing?" The lead criminal snarled, his rifle wavering between Gideon and the rocks where he could sense hidden danger. "Waiting for you to make a choice," Gideon said quietly. "See, you can shoot me, but the moment you pull that trigger, you'll have bigger problems than whatever's chasing you up that mountain." The criminal's eyes darted around nervously. His two companions reached the rocky outcrop, gasping and bleeding from cuts sustained during their panicked climb. They'd lost their horses, most of their ammunition, and clearly hadn't eaten in days. "We just need to use your cave for a few hours," the leader said, trying to sound reasonable. "Then we'll be gone." "That cave belongs to the tribe whose land you're standing on," Gideon replied, pulling out the carved stone. "And they don't take kindly to trespassers." The moment the criminals saw the tribal artifact, their faces went white. They'd spent enough time in the territory to know what it meant. "You're working with them," the second man gasped. "I'm trying to keep you alive," Gideon said. "Which is more than you deserve after what you did to Marshal Crawford." The leader's rifle snapped back to Gideon. "How do you know about that?" "Because you're carrying his weapon, and his blood is still on your clothes." Gideon's voice stayed steady despite his racing heart. "Question is, how many other innocent people did you kill on your way up here?" Behind the rocks, Takakota's warriors remained hidden but ready. Gideon could feel their presence like coiled springs, waiting for the signal to strike. But he also knew that once the violence started, it wouldn't stop until everyone was dead. "Here's what's going to happen," Gideon continued. "You're going to put down your weapons and surrender to tribal justice, or you're going to keep running and hope you make it to the territorial border before winter kills you." "Like hell," the leader spat. "We're taking that cave." But as he stepped forward, an arrow buried itself in the ground 6 inches from his boot. Then another, then a third, each one closer than the last. The criminals spun around wildly, trying to spot the archers, but saw only empty rocks and shifting shadows. Panic began to overtake desperation in their eyes. 30 warriors," Gideon said conversationally. "All around you, all with orders to take you alive if possible." He paused. "But they're not feeling particularly merciful after what you did to their families." The truth hit the criminals like a physical blow. They weren't being chased by a small hunting party. They'd stumbled into the territory of an entire war band seeking vengeance. "You led us into a trap," the leader accused, his voice cracking. "You led yourselves," Gideon replied, "the moment you chose to spill innocent blood on sacred ground." Another arrow whispered past the second criminal's ear, and his nerve broke completely. He dropped his rifle and raised his hands, tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. "I surrender. I surrender." But the leader wasn't finished. With nothing left to lose and madness gleaming in his eyes, he swung his rifle toward Gideon. "If I'm dying today, you're coming with me." The shot echoed across the mountains, but Gideon never felt the bullet. A tomahawk had already found its mark, and the criminal leader crumpled to the ground before his finger could fully squeeze the trigger. Takakota emerged from behind the rocks, his remaining warriors flowing around the 2 surviving criminals like water around stones. In seconds, the threat was over. But as Gideon stood up, brushing dirt from his clothes, he realized something that chilled him more than the mountain wind. The gunshot would bring cavalry troops within days, and when they arrived, they'd find dead settlers in tribal territory with Gideon as the only witness to what really happened. The carved stone in his palm grew warm as the weight of what came next settled on his shoulders like fresh snow. Sometimes the hardest choice isn't between right and wrong. Sometimes it's between 2 different kinds of right, and the consequences of that choice echo through generations. Within hours, Captain Morrison and 20 cavalry soldiers crested the ridge, their blue uniforms stark against the winter landscape. At their head rode a man with the weathered look of a career frontier officer, his eyes already scanning for signs of the violence that had brought them here. Gideon stood alone beside his cave, 2 bound criminals at his feet, preparing to tell a story that would either save an entire tribe or condemn them all. The captain reined in his horse 10 feet away, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "Son, I'm Captain Morrison, Territorial Cavalry." We're tracking 3 men who killed a federal marshal and attacked a military convoy. Have you seen them?" Gideon met the captain's gaze steadily, the carved stone warm in his palm. "I saw them, Captain. 3 men, desperate and dangerous. They came through here 2 days ago, demanding supplies and shelter." The captain dismounted, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the camp. "And I refused to help criminals," Gideon said simply. "Told them to move on." That's when the shooting started. He pointed to a darkened scar on the cave wall. "Warning shots, trying to scare me into cooperation." When that didn't work, they took what little food I had and headed into the high country. Captain Morrison examined the bullet mark, the scattered brass casings, the signs of struggle. Everything supported Gideon's story perfectly. "These the men who were with them?" the captain asked, nodding toward the bound criminals. "No, sir. These 2 showed up yesterday, half frozen and starving. Said they'd been traveling with the gang but got separated during a snowstorm in the deep canyon." The older prisoner nodded frantically. "That's right, Captain. Crawford tried to arrest us for claim jumping, but when he wouldn't take our partner's bribe, they shot him. Me and Billy here, we just ran when the killing started." The younger criminal was crying again. "We never wanted anybody to die. When the shooting started in that canyon, we just kept running. Haven't seen our partners since." Captain Morrison studied their faces carefully. Frontier soldiers learn to read desperation and truth in equal measure. "You're saying your partners are still out there?" "If they're still alive," Billy whispered. "That canyon's a death trap in winter. Nobody could survive up there without proper gear." The captain walked to the edge of the rocky outcrop and stared into the vast wilderness beyond. Miles of treacherous terrain, hidden ravines, and early winter storms that could bury men without a trace. "We'll search the area," Morrison decided. "But if they went into the deep country during that storm," he shrugged. "Nature's got its own justice out here." Gideon felt relief flood through him but kept his expression neutral. "What about these 2? They'll stand trial for their part in Crawford's death, but their cooperation will be noted." The captain mounted his horse. "Son, you did the right thing, refusing to help those killers. Took courage." As the cavalry prepared to leave with their prisoners, Captain Morrison paused. "You planning to winter up here alone?" Gideon looked toward the hidden rocks where he knew Takakota's warriors waited. "Actually, Captain, I've been offered a place with some local friends. Good people who know these mountains better than anyone. Smart choice. These peaks aren't forgiving to men without allies." After the soldiers disappeared down the mountain trail, Takakota emerged from concealment, his warriors flowing out of the landscape like morning mist. The chief's weathered face showed something Gideon had never seen before, genuine gratitude mixed with deep respect. "You spoke well, brother," Takakota said, using the tribal word that meant family by choice rather than blood. "Your words have prevented much bloodshed." Gideon held out the carved stone, but Takakota shook his head. "Keep it, you have earned the right." The chief placed a firm hand on Gideon's shoulder. "Our winter camp has room for 1 more, if you choose to stay." Looking back at his empty cave, then at the warriors who had accepted him as family, Gideon's decision came easily. "I choose to stay." That evening, as snow began falling on the high peaks, Gideon sat beside a warm fire in the tribal camp, learning his first words in their language while Ayana translated stories of courage and belonging. The homeless boy who had nothing was now a brother to an entire people. His act of simple kindness had transformed not just his own destiny, but prevented a war that could have destroyed countless innocent lives. The carved stone rested in his palm, no longer a mysterious artifact, but a symbol of the family he had gained by choosing compassion over safety, courage over comfort. Sometimes, the smallest acts of mercy can prevent the greatest tragedies. And sometimes, when you think you have nothing left to give, that's exactly when you discover what you're truly made of.